Hi guys, today we're going to be reading parts of Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. As you know, when we're reading through, we do not read every single part, so I'm going to be skipping around and not reading full paragraphs because there's specific pieces that we want you guys to know and understand. You will have some different questions to answer throughout the Edpuzzle, and I will also be going over and explaining some things to you as well. All right, so let's take a look at Chapter 6, and we're going to look at the very first paragraph, and I do read the entire first paragraph. Here goes. My new mistress proved to be all she appeared when I first met her at the door, a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previously to myself, and prior to her marriage she had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. She was by trade a weaver, and by constant application to her business, she had been in a good degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. I could not approach her as I was accustomed to approach other white ladies. My early instruction was all out of place. The crouching servility, usually so acceptable a quality in a slave, did not answer when manifested toward her. Her favor was not gained by it. She seemed to be disturbed by it. She did not deem it impudent or unmannerly for a slave to look her in the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence, and none left without feeling better for having seen her. Her face was made of heavenly smiles, and her voice of tranquil music. All right, so basically that paragraph is talking about the fact that he had his new mistress, and when he first met her, she was one of the kindest people he'd ever met. She was married, obviously, to the slave owner, and she was a weaver, so that means she worked with clothing, and she just was never a person who was around slavery, so she didn't know how to act towards the slaves, and she thought it was very weird and strange for these slaves to be so worried to be around her and wouldn't look her in the face. She didn't like that. She felt uncomfortable with that. She wanted to talk to the slaves and have them talk back to her and not worry about the fact that they couldn't look at her in the face. So that was, again, a very different way for somebody like Frederick Douglass and the other slaves to see one of their slave owners, to be this kind person. She didn't find it to be disrespectful for them to talk to her. And again, they found that to be very strange. So she was a very kind, very hardworking woman, and she was just uncomfortable with the whole concept of slavery. There's actually a poetic tool that Douglass used to reinforce her personality. He said that her face was made of heavenly smiles and her voice of tranquil music. So what kind of a poetic tool is that? All right, so moving along, she again was very kind toward the slaves. She did not treat them terribly. She did not want them to be submissive, meaning that she didn't want them to just do what she says and not ever say anything back. So again, a very different way for a slave owner to behave. So this was very strange for Frederick Douglass overall. All right, let's go on to the next paragraph. Again, we will read this full paragraph. But alas, this kind heart had but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and soon commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage. That voice, made all of sweet accord, changed to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. So the fatal poison of irresponsible power, that means owning a slave or having power over another person, is kind of like poison. It kills your soul. So she basically, when she became an owner of a slave, she completely changed and became evil rather than the loving person she seemed to appear to be when he first met her. So that kind heart had a short time to remain. She fell into the ways of being a slave owner and became cruel herself. So again, he uses some different types of poetic tools here to support that idea. And so we're going to have a question about that for you to answer. All right, let's go ahead and on to the next paragraph. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, "If you give an inch, he will take an ell. A should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best in the world. Now," said he, "if you teach that," speaking of myself, "how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy." These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Okay, so basically, Mr. Auld is telling his wife to teach a slave, she must not do it because it would make him worthless and unhappy. And teaching a slave would make him unfit, because basically what he is saying is that the more a slave knows, the more unhappy he's going to become with his position. Slave owners are basically there to control the slaves. They want to keep them ignorant and not know anything. And so this is why he does not want Mrs. Auld to teach Frederick how to read. Again, he uses some different poetic tools here, and I'm going to ask you a question about that. All right, let's move along to our next paragraph that we're going to be reading. The next ones we're going to be reading now, we're going to be in the middle of this paragraph. So we're starting off with, it says here, though conscious of the difficulty of learning. So I'll bring that up for us to go. Okay. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. The very decided manner with which he spoke, and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction, served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. It gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the results, which he said would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded, that I most desired. What he most loved, that I most hated. That which to him was a great evil, to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good, to be diligently sought. All right, so basically what is happening here is Douglas is resolved to go ahead and learn how to read. Even though Mr. Auld says it's bad for him and it's not going to be a good thing for him to learn, he's not agreeing with that. He's going to do whatever he can to learn how to read. He finds that very important. And the argument which he so warmly urged against my learning to read only served to inspire me with a desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. Okay, so again, he's saying he's going to make sure that he learns how to read, and he's going to be able to thank both his master and his wife for learning to read because he gave him that desire to do so. She started to actually teach him, and then he got the desire to continue from his master. All right, the next paragraph we're going to read is going to be coming from chapter 7. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of a mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. When I went there, she was a pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Okay, so basically they're saying that when she first got there, she was a very kind and gentle person, but now she's going to be turning into this fierce, unfeeling lady. She stopped teaching him how to read and started to become actually opposed to him learning how to read. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simply doing as well as he had commanded. She seemed anxious to do better. All right, so again, she stopped teaching him to read. She was opposed to him learning how to read, and she became even more violent in that opposition than her husband himself. So she turned from this wonderful, kind-hearted, tender lady into this really mean and cruel master. So Frederick Douglass saw that change. And so he's describing to you how basically becoming a slave owner changes you. It makes you a different person, and it makes you a not so nice person overall. And that's what happened to Mrs. Auld. All right. This is another glimpse into the life of Frederick Douglass, and also a little practice with some of our poetic tools that we learned this week. So hopefully you guys, again, understand where he's coming from to talk about Mrs. Auld and what it was like to live with her. And we will continue on with our study of poems and Frederick Douglass later on this week. Have a great day, guys. Thanks.